First of all, thank you to CEDA to have the opportunity to be here, and thank you, Stephen, for the plug. I'll give you the cheque afterwards, but it was money well spent. Thank you. There's nothing like a bit of an advertising. My brief is to discuss the importance of the G20 in the global political economy, and particularly in the context of trade liberalisation. But I'll start by trying to link all this to the overall theme of this session, which is about Australia's place in the region, trade and security in the G20 priorities. Now, the link I would draw as follows. As Bruce had outlined, as we all know, Australia has this great advantage of proximity. The centre of global economic weight, it's moving east, it's moving towards us, our region. China, it's poised to pass the US as the world's largest economy in purchasing power parity terms, even if China doesn't really want to step up to the demands of global economic leadership. There will be hiccups on the way, but the trend is inevitable. Now, the change in the global economic landscape, it has to be matched by a similar change in the arrangements for global economic governance. And these new players, they have to step up to the mark and contribute to global economic leadership. In short, Asia, and particularly China, will have to play a bigger role in global governance, commensurate with its weight in the global economy. Now, these transitions and shifts in relative economic power, they may not be smooth. And the same applies to shifts in political power and influence. And for some countries to have more power and influence, others do have to have less. While based on past trends, the economic outlook for our region is generally seen as very positive, the security outlook is becoming more volatile. While China may appear reluctant to take on the responsibilities of one of the world's major economies, it is seeking to be more assertive in the region, in its role in the region, as evidenced with its tussle with its neighbours over maritime security, contestable territory, the location of exploration rigs and so on. Now, how does trade fit in with this increasingly complex regional dynamic, the one that Australia is in? Well, closer economic integration is an important counterbalance to potential political and security concerns, and trade and investment liberalisation is the driving mechanism of closer integration between economies for stronger growth. A key element of the US pivot to Asia, as we heard from the Consul General this morning, is the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and it is intended to deepen the economic integration of participating countries in the region and to bolster US political influence in the region. There is a lot more at stake with trade agreements than just trade. China's counter-approach is its support for the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership negotiations, the RCEP. But both Asia and the US, they do have to contribute to a global economic leadership, and they need to take responsibility for the multilateral trading system, a system that has been an important contributor to the growth in the Asian region. So what about Australia's role? Well, as we all know, we're part of Asia, physically and economically. We're an important, middle-sized, open trading economy. Our prosperity relies on an open, rules-based international trading and investment system. And it's in Australia's direct interest to ensure that there are appropriate and effective forums for international economic cooperation. And it's in Australia's direct interest to ensure that the countries in our region, particularly China, play a bigger role in these forums, a role that reflects their global economic weight. Now, as chair of the G20 in 2014, we have an opportunity, and if not a responsibility, to try and help promote these objectives. The world does need effective international cooperation, and it does need global economic leadership. The absence of such cooperation and leadership will not only lead to a weaker and more volatile global economy, it will contribute to a more volatile international security environment. We need cooperation because we live in an integrated world. As the IMF Managing Director recently said, the breakneck pattern of integration and interconnectedness defines our times. And the global financial crisis, it illustrated the extent of our interconnectedness. The failure of a few important, although not considered essential financial institutions at the time, in the US resulted in a global financial and economic crisis. And in response, the G20 leaders meeting in 2009 demonstrated the benefits that can come from cooperation among some of the major economies. Now, the strength of the G20 is that it reflects the changing global economy, particularly the inclusion of major economies such as China, India and Brazil. Its weakness is its size and the diversity of membership, different economic, political, social systems. Now, these differences have become more marked as the spirit of cooperation that existed in the midst of the crisis weakens. And lifting the voice of Asia in global economic forums is not plain sailing, particularly given the security tensions and the rather complicated geopolitical reasons that exist in Asia. Now, there's a widespread view that the best days of the G20 may be behind it, and that was its immediate response to the crisis. And it is easy to say that we need closer international cooperation through forums such as the G20, but it's harder to define what that actually means. The division between clearly domestic matters and those that have spillovers on other countries, both positive and negative, it's not straightforward. Moreover, the economic fortunes of individual countries, they're primarily determined by their own domestic policies. Countries don't have to go to summits to pursue good policies that are overwhelmingly in their own interests. And the problem is normally in doing the right thing and introducing the right economic policies is not the absence of summits. It's usually domestic politics is the stumbling block. However, there are issues that no one country can solve operating unilaterally. The financial crisis demonstrated we needed cooperation to deal with globally operating financial institutions, something that David Gruen was talking about this morning with the too big to fail. Tax and trade are other examples. Like finance, policy in these areas faces the challenge of keeping up with an increasingly global and interconnected business landscape. More and more business is operating globally. Trade policy has to adapt to the reality of value chains that are driving international trade. Goods are more likely to be made in the world with inputs from many other countries than made solely in one country. Value chains, global value chains, but value chains dominate intra-Asian trade. The mercantilist view that exports are good and imports are bad, and the traditional negotiating stance that market access can only be granted as a concession for access to another country's market has to change. Liberalising trade, restrictions and internal impediments to trade is all about improving the competitiveness of your economy and your exports. Now, these same forces are challenging the appropriateness of international tax laws, namely through base erosion and profit shifting. With globally operating firms have the ability to exploit loopholes in national laws and declare profits in low or no tax jurisdictions. The rise of global value chains has been facilitated by technological developments, particularly the digital age, and those same forces have been driving financial innovation, interconnectedness and transforming international taxation. Now, this isn't going to stop. Technological change isn't going to stop. More and more goods and services will be delivered over the internet, something that Steve Minchenberg was talking about this morning in terms of the impact of technology on financial exercises. More and more of it is going to be driven by technology. And what this means is that individual nation states are going to find it increasingly difficult to set laws covering globally operating businesses. Now, in this world, this is where international and effective international cooperation is essential. We need forums such as the G20 to help facilitate cooperation, particularly in such international areas as trade, tax, globally operating financial firms. And I would add climate change to a truly international issue that requires international cooperation. Now, before just going on and saying a few words about the role the G20 could play in facilitating global trade, the other point I would make is that a consequence of this integrated world is the need to have effective and representative international economic institutions. Forums such as the G20 have an important role to use their political weight to ensure that the international bodies that exist are doing the job the world expects of them. These international institutions, they really are the plumbing of this interconnected world, and we do need strong plumbing. For example, achieving the G20's aim of lifting global growth by an extra 2% by 2018 will require countries implementing difficult reforms, domestically, politically difficult reforms. Now, that will be facilitated by effective oversight by the international institutions such as the IMF. But this in turn will require reforming the governance structure of the IMF to bolster its legitimacy and effectiveness in its surveillance functions. The Financial Stability Board is a recent entity that has been driving international financial reforms, but its representation needs to be reformed, and it requires improved processes in developing and monitoring the new standards, particularly in terms of their appropriateness to emerging markets and developing countries. And it's particularly important for Asia to be more involved and take greater ownership in the work of such institutions like the FSB, which is still perceived as a North Atlantic dominated body. While Asia's global economic weight has grown, this has not been reproduced in terms of its global financial weight. The dominant global banks are outside Asia, but all this is going to change. China's banks are going to become increasingly global. The next financial crisis may well be centred in Asia, may well be centred in China. So we should be encouraging China to take a leadership role in these institutions like the Financial Stability Board. It would be great when we start to see some Asian leadership in these institutions. And the arrangements for the governance of global energy needs to be brought into the 21st century. For example, the most authoritative body, the International Energy Agency, has OECD membership as its prerequisite. As such, countries such as China, Brazil, India and Russia, they're excluded. This has to change, and this should be a job of the G20, changing these things. And we are witnessing some change in the arrangements for dealing with international tax laws. International tax was the traditional preserve of the OECD, but we now have a G20 OECD project looking at this base erosion profit shifting, and the non-OECD G20 members have an equal say in this exercise as OECD members. But it has a timetable of work that is meant to end in September 2015. But this is a complex and it will be an ongoing exercise, and we do need to formalise more inclusive processes that extend beyond 2015, including more direct involvement of developing countries in dealing with international tax. Again, these are the type of things that the G20 should be trying to drive. What about trade liberalisation and the role of the G20? Well, the Prime Minister has said trade will be a priority for the G20 in 2014, and it should be. Trade really should be the centre of this growth objective, centre of trying to lift the global economy. But the G20 is a global forum, so the focus cannot be on bilateral or regional arrangements. The mega trade deals being negotiated, they are discriminatory, and they do discriminate against almost all developing countries. As a global forum, the G20's focus should be on the multilateral trading system. Now, the G20, it's not the place for detailed trade negotiations, but it is the place to provide strategic political direction and for the future of the global trading system. Now, here are some specific suggestions as what I think should be the focus at the Brisbane Summit. First of all, the G20 leaders should strengthen their standstill on introducing new protectionist pressures. The WTO monitors compliance with this commitment that was made not to introduce new protectionist measures, but performance has been patchy. The reports that the WTO produces, they're not discussed in leaders' meetings, they should be, and they should be given a lot more publicity. Leaders should agree to extend the monitoring to cover the introduction of non-tariff barriers to trade, those murky protectionism, and they should make specific commitments to remove the restrictive barriers that they have introduced since the crisis, and they should make a commitment that this will be monitored by the WTO. As such, the G20 should be working hard to strengthen the WTO. The world needs a strong WTO. G20 members should also commit to the early implementation of the Bali Trade Facilitation Agreement that was reached last December. That's really removing the obstacles to trade, the behind-the-border obstacles to trade. It's getting rid of administrative impediments and reducing the cost of the movement of goods and services. Now, the Doha round, it does have to be concluded, and the world needs to move on with more effective ways to advance multilateral trade liberalisation. Leaders should call on WTO ministers to identify another achievable package of measures, call for speedy resolution, and say that's the conclusion of the Doha round. G20 leaders, they should focus on the direction of the multilateral trading system in a post-Doha world, one that avoids ambitious and wide-ranging agendas with a single undertaking like Doha, where nothing's agreed until everything's agreed. The future negotiations should be targeted in specific areas, including plurilateral agreements, which allow WTO members to opt into the agreement, such as the Information Technology Agreement, International Services Agreement, Government Procurement Agreements. Now, leaders should agree on the future of the WTO, and they should say it should be anchored around the governance of global value chains and the implications for international trade negotiation. Leaders should also commit to ensuring compatibility between regional trade arrangements and the rules of the WTO. Work should commence on defining concrete mechanisms for monitoring and reviewing regional trade agreements in the WTO. Again, strengthen the WTO. The G20 should be pushing for consistency in the rules of regional agreements, such as the rules of origin and technical and health standards and so on. Now, the G20 should also commit to ensuring that developing countries have the technical and financial support to benefit from trade liberalisation. Is this doable? It will be hard. It will take a focused effort by the Prime Minister, the Trade Minister, and by officials. But if the G20 is to be the premier forum for international economic cooperation, it has to take on these really difficult issues, such as promoting further international trade liberalisation. Progress here would make the Brisbane Summit truly worth the effort. Thank you.